Hello, loved ones. I missed you last week because I am getting over some COVID right now. My voice is just now starting to get back to where I can string a sentence together without coughing all over people's faces, though I've been quarantining the entire time. Last week, of course, I was not available for the Bible study, the 24th chapter of Genesis, part 2. But Reverend Stone did an excellent job of covering for both myself and Pastor Conity. And however, am not able to get that video onto YouTube, onto the YouTube channel. So now I'm gonna record kind of a short version of Genesis 24 part 2 in order to get my notes included into the YouTube channel in the interest of making it more of a complete tome. So I've prayed, and I'll pray again with you that God guides me and guides my tongue as I go here through the second half of the 24th chapter of Genesis. And I'm going to kind of go through it pretty quickly. If you already saw Reverend Stone last week live on the Facebook channel, he covered it very well, and I'm going to go through it here for the YouTube crowd. We left off at verse 33. As we know right now, Eleazar, supposedly we believe is Eleazar, is looking for a wife for Isaac right now. He believes he may have found the right girl. He's about to sit down and have dinner with her family, but he doesn't even want to eat until he explains to everybody, explains to the family why he's there and what he's trying to do. Excuse me. Pardon me. COVID, right? So in verse 33, then food was served. But Abraham's servant said, I don't want to eat until I have told you why I have come. All right, Laban said, tell us, Laban being Rebekah's brother. Verse 34, I am Abraham's servant, he explained, and the Lord has greatly blessed my master. He has become a wealthy man. The Lord has given him flocks of sheep and goats, herds of cattle, a fortune in silver and gold, and many male and female servants, and camels and donkeys. When Sarah, my master's wife, was very old, she gave birth to my master's son, and my master has given him everything he owns. And my master made me take an oath, he said. Do not allow my son to marry one of these local Canaanite women. Go instead to my father's house, to my relatives, and find a wife there for my son. But I said to my master, what if I can't find a young woman who is willing to go back with me? He responded, the Lord, in whose presence I have lived, will send his angel with you and will make your mission successful. Yes, you must find a wife for my son from among my relatives, from my father's family. Then you will have fulfilled your obligation. But if you go to my relatives and they refuse to let her go with you, you will be free from my oath. So today when I came to the spring, I prayed this prayer, O Lord God of my master Abraham, please give me success on this mission. See, I am standing here beside this spring. This is my request. When a young woman comes to draw water, I will say to her, please give me a little drink of water from your jug. If she says, yes, have a drink, and I will draw water for your camels too, let her be the one you have selected to be the wife of my master's son. Before I had finished praying in my heart, I saw Rebekah coming out with her water jug on her shoulder. She went down to the spring and drew water. So I said to her, please give me a drink. She quickly lowered her jug from her shoulder and said, yes, have a drink, and I will water your camels too. So I drank, and then she watered the camels. We're going to stop right there. That was ending at verse 46. Here at verse 34, we know that, again, as I said last week, or in the previous lesson, we don't know that this is actually Eleazar, but we do know that this is his oldest servant. We know that this is somebody who is like a family member to Abraham and to Isaac as well, perhaps like an older brother to Isaac in many ways. We know that Abraham has always treated his slaves very well and has always treated them like family members, which is God's original design for servanthood. We know that here in the very beginning of verse 34, he refers to himself as Abraham's servant. He doesn't even use his own name. If you recall in the Gospel of John, John refers to himself as the disciple that Jesus loves. He doesn't even use his own name. He doesn't even use his own name in his own gospel. And Eleazar is showing the same kind of modesty in his recounting as well. And by the way, the reason we're not reviewing a whole lot of last week is because Eleazar is essentially telling the entire story of what happened in the first half of this chapter. Verse 35, and the Lord has greatly blessed my master. He has become a wealthy man. The Lord has given him flocks of sheep and goats, herds of cattle, a fortune in silver and gold, and many male and female servants, and camels and donkeys. So, Eleazar is playing the strings of Laban's heart here. Laban, he's a very materialistic individual. We will see this more about his materialism, especially in his dealings with his nephew Jacob in the coming chapters. So Eleazar has picked up on this and is appealing to Laban's materialistic nature by talking about how rich Abraham is. And it's evident that Laban has also seen the bracelets and the ring that Eleazar gave to Laban's sister, Rebekah. Verse 36, when Sarah, my master's wife, was very old, she gave birth to my master's son. Very old. Basically what he's saying right here is, he's noting the miraculous nature of the event. Sarah having a child at the age of 90. Verse 37, and my master made me take an oath. He said, don't allow my son to marry one of these local Canaanite women down there in Beersheba where they were living. 38, go instead to my father's house, to my relatives, and find a wife there for my son. Now, the inclusion of relatives in the charge here, it's actually not in verse 4 of the Torah, but it is in the Bible. And the fact that it's mentioned in verses 38, 40, and 41, the charge of Abraham telling Eleazar to go to his relatives is important. The Jewish community sees this as Eleazar is kind of embellishing on the story in an attempt to convince Laban and the family to let Rebekah come back with him to be a wife for Isaac. Perhaps some of Abraham's deceptive nature has rubbed off on Eleazar at this point. Whether or not you believe those were Eleazar's motives at the time, here in just a moment we'll see something that points a little bit more to Eleazar trying to twist the facts just a little bit in order to convince Laban and the family. In verse 40, he responded, the Lord in whose presence I have lived will send his angel with you and will make your mission successful. This is Abraham talking to Eleazar, or Eleazar's account of Abraham talking to him. Again, we hear about this angel that was also mentioned in verse 7, though this angel is never actually seen in this chapter. There is no event that we would consider a theophany at this point, but it is undeniable that God's influence is undeniable. even though we don't actually have a theophany in this chapter. By the way, in verse 45, before I had finished praying in my heart, I saw Rebekah coming out with her water jug on her shoulder. When he says, I saw, here's that word. I'm just mentioning it in passing right now, but it will be mentioned. We'll talk about it a lot more. We've already talked it in chapter 22. Hineni, lo and behold, in your Strong's it's 2009. He could essentially be saying in verse 45, before I had finished praying in my heart, lo and behold, Rebekah came out with her water jug. That's what Hineni means. It means, they are strong words that talk about the full presence of exactly what is happening, and talking about how this is a big deal. This is not a small event that is happening. By the way, for those of you who are into psychology, where he talks about praying in his heart, this word is 3820 for his heart, the inner man, the mind, the heart. This could be the Jungian concept of the self or the ego, also drafting off of Freud in that regard. Looking at verse 47, we're moving on here, and watch this. Check out the order of things, the order of these events. Verse 47, then I asked, this is Eleazar still telling the story to Laban and family. Then I asked, whose daughter are you? She replied, I am the daughter of Bethuel, and my grandparents are Nahor and Milcah. So I put the ring on her nose and the bracelets on her wrists. Is that how it happened? So he asked, whose daughter are you? She said, I'm the daughter of Bethuel. And then he gave her the ring for her nose and the bracelets on her wrists. Let's check out verses. We're going to start with. I'm going to start with verse 21. This is verse 21, and I'm going to read through. Give me one moment. I'll tell you exactly where I'm going to go. I'm going to start 21, 22, and 23. The servant watched her in silence, wondering whether or not the Lord had given him success in his mission. Verse 22. Then at last, when the camels had finished drinking, he took out a gold ring for her nose and 2 large gold bracelets for her wrists. Verse 23, whose daughter are you, he asked, and please tell me, would your father have any room to put us up for the night? Before, it's been a little debatable that whether or not Eleazar is, twisting some truth to try to convince Laban and the family to let Rebekah go. But right here we see in the original order of events, Laban gave the jewelry to Rebekah before he even knew whose family she belonged to. But here in verse 47, he switches the events, probably to flatter Laban and the family. 47, then I asked, whose daughter are you? She replied, I am the daughter of Bethuel, and my grandparents are Nahor and Milcah. So I put the ring on her nose and the bracelets on her wrists. Switches the order right there to flatter the family, probably. Moving on, verse 48. Then I bowed low and worshiped the Lord. I praised the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, because he had led me straight to my master's niece to be his son's wife. So tell me, will you or won't you show unfailing love and faithfulness to my master? Please tell me yes or no, and then I'll know what to do next. Then Laban and Bethuel replied, the Lord has obviously brought you here, so there is nothing we can say. Here is Rebekah, take her and go. Yes, let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has directed. When Abraham's servant heard their answer, he bowed down to the ground and worshiped the Lord. Then he brought out silver and gold jewelry and clothing and presented them to Rebekah. He also gave expensive presents to her brother and mother. Then they ate their meal, and the servant and the men with him stayed there overnight. But early the next morning, Abraham's servant said, "Send me back to my master." Ending right there. That was verse 54. We'll go on with 54 on through in just a moment. I'm going to take a moment to point out in verse 50, this is the first time we're seeing Bethuel, the father of Laban and Rebekah, in this account. It's likely, we talked about, it's likely that Laban is in charge of the family right now, given some of the language we heard regarding Rebekah's mother's tent or her household, and as well as the fact that Bethuel isn't really showing up a lot right now. We think that in one way or another, he was probably incapacitated. He was probably very old at this time. But we do notice at verse 50, as Laban had done before, he is still invoking the name of the Lord, Yahweh, 3068. Understanding that they're a pagan family, but it's likely that they heard, of course, they've just heard this entire story from Eleazar, invoking the name of Yahweh many times throughout and referring to his master as a follower of Yahweh. And it's also likely that either Rebekah heard Eleazar praying to Yahweh at the spring, or Laban did as well. So they're still invoking the name of this Lord that we don't know they actually believed in or even prayed to. If they did pray to him, he might have been, God might have been one of many gods that they were praying to at the time. But we wonder if they're playing the same game that Eleazar is playing as well, invoking Yahweh's name, saying, well, hey, you've got 10 camels worth of gold and presents here, if we can trade, make a deal here and send Rebekah on her way, how much of these presents can we get out of this guy? Let's make him let's convince him that we're believing in the same Yahweh and the same Lord and the same God as him. Of course, we could give them the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps they all converted to Yahweh as far as we know, but it's kind of unlikely, to be honest with you, given the culture of the day. Verse 54, then they ate their meal. Because as you recall, right where we began, where we ended last week and where we began in verse 33, Eleazar, he wouldn't even eat until the success of his mission was assured. It's a good servant there. Verse 54, and I'm going to move on. Then they ate their meal, and the servant and the men with him stayed there overnight. But early the next morning, Abraham's servant said, "Send me back to my master." Verse 55, but we want Rebekah to stay with us at least 10 days. Her brother and mother said, then she can go. But he said, this is the servant, don't delay me. The Lord has made my mission successful. Now send me back so I can return to my master. Well, they said, we'll call Rebekah and ask her what she thinks. So they called Rebekah. Are you willing to go with this man? They asked her. And she replied, yes, I will go. Check this out in verse 56. But he said, don't delay me. The Lord has made my mission successful. Now send me back so I can return to my master. There's a story in the 19th chapter of Judges. I use this particular story here in the 24th chapter of Genesis when I talk about the story in the 19th chapter of Judges. There's a man in the 19th chapter of Judges that could have taken a cue from Eleazar and left at a much earlier time than he did, and avoided the subsequent tragedy and war that would come as a result of delaying. If you'd like to jump to Judges chapter 19, it is one of the darker chapters in the Bible. Excuse me. Verse 57. Well, they said, we'll call Rebekah and asked her what she thinks. So they called Rebekah. Are you willing to go with this man? They asked her, which I think is nice. They're showing respect for her desires, though she was a woman. People weren't as concerned about the will of women at the time. And so before we talk about how it seems like Rebekah is being traded here like livestock, let's remember that in those days, people were mostly concentrating on not dying. They were mostly concentrating on survival methods. And it's unlikely that Rebekah had what we think of as a career or any kind of ambitions beyond having and raising a family in those days. This isn't like she was, we're pulling her out of college or we're taking her away from her fig tree stand, that she, or her entrepreneurial endeavors. At this point, women were just trying to not die, as were men. And one of the best ways to do that was to stay a part of a family. Remember when we talked about Hagar and her exile and how, or her running away was akin to suicide, running away from a community. Well, that's what people depended on, was a community in order to not die. It's likely that Rebekah would be interested in the most comfortable lifestyle she could have with a family. And besides, in this instance, Rebekah is being respected more than Isaac because Isaac's 500 miles away. Rebekah gets a choice. Isaac's just going to take whatever wife Eleazar shows up with. But we can say that her willingness to leave immediately does suggest respect for the will of God. And, of course, the more we learn about the materialistic nature of Laban, it's understandable why she might want to move on with her life and choose a life of comfort and riches over a life of fetching water. Verse 59, excuse me. Verse 59. So they said goodbye to Rebekah and sent her away with Abraham's servant and his men. The woman who had been Rebekah's childhood nurse went along with her. They gave her this blessing as she departed. This is the blessing they gave Rebekah. Our sister, may you become the mother of many millions. May your descendants be strong and conquer the cities of their enemies. In verse 59, that childhood nurse, we know her name is Deborah because her name is mentioned upon her death in chapter 35, verse 8. And, I searched through to find out what else we know from the Bible about Deborah. And you know what I found? Nothing. That's pretty much all it says about Rebekah's childhood nurse. This blessing they gave her in verse 60, our sister, may you become the mother of many millions. That's the first half of the blessing. In Hebrew would say, oh sister, may you grow into thousands of myriads, which is a blessing given by rabbi to brides when they are veiled before their wedding in Jewish weddings and Jewish customs. And the irony of it being, the first time this blessing was ever given, it was given by people who weren't even Hebrew. The second part of this blessing, may your descendants be strong and conquer the cities of their enemies. Or in Hebrew, may your offspring seize the gates of their foes, which is a pretty cryptic blessing pretty cryptic marital blessing, but they did know that Rebekah was being sent into unfriendly territory. Verse 61, then Rebekah and her servant girls mounted the camels and followed the man. So Abraham's servant took Rebekah and went on his way. Meanwhile, Isaac, whose home was in the Negev, had returned from Beer-lahai-roi. One evening, as he was walking and meditating in the fields, he looked up and saw the camels coming. When Rebekah looked up and saw Isaac, she quickly dismounted from her camel. "Who is that man walking through the fields to meet us?" she asked the servant. And he replied, "It is my master." So Rebekah covered her face with her veil. Then the servant told Isaac everything he had done. So Isaac here, we're seeing him now actually being introduced finally. In verse 62, he would be 40 years old at this point, according to chapter 25, verse 20, which would make Abraham 140. Now, I talk about the passivity of Isaac and how, and we'll get in the next couple chapters, we'll go pretty far into how this ends up being much more of a problem for him. We go through the scoreboard of all the problems that Abraham creates for himself through his aggression and passivity, most obviously more through his passivity. But we shouldn't really blame Isaac for allowing a family servant to choose a wife for him. This was customary, or, families chose spouses for each other. But we can give him throw some shade his way for waiting until he's 40 to do so. He's still living in the tent of his mother at the age of 40. Of course, this is, again, as his passivity is consistent with that of his father's. This, we know that Abraham didn't leave his father's tent until he was 75. And we know this from chapter 12, verse 4. Meanwhile, Isaac, whose home was in the Negev, had returned from Beer-lahai-roi. You remember that's the well that Hagar named in the 16th chapter, verse 14. And, this might be a sign of some activity in Isaac, because by the 11th verse of chapter 25, he's going to be living there. He's going to be living there with Rebekah. So he might have been checking out the place in anticipation of finding a home for himself and his approaching bride. So he might not have been completely passive. We can give him a little bit of credit there. One evening, as he was walking and meditating in the fields, he looked up and saw the camels coming. When it says meditating here, the Strongs, we're trying to, this is the only occurrence of this word in the Bible. It's unlikely he was meditating like we think of in the Buddhist or Hindu sense. It says perhaps to muse in Strong's. This is 7742. And by muse, of the many definitions, the most appropriate one would be the verb form, be absorbed in thought. So he's walking through the fields. He's absorbed in thought. He's a thoughtful guy. And then the final verse. And Isaac brought Rebekah into his mother Sarah's tent, and she became his wife. He loved her deeply, and she was a special comfort to him after the death of his mother. A special comfort to him after the death of his mother. Again, if we're analyzing this as psychologists, this is an example of the healthy Oedipal tendencies to replace opposite sex parents with a spouse. And we know that Rebekah is essentially becoming the matriarch of the family after the death of Sarah. She's replacing Sarah in more ways than one. But what I want to focus mostly on is this line here, he loved her deeply. Let me read the whole verse again. And Isaac brought Rebekah into his mother Sarah's tent, and she became his wife. He loved her deeply, and she was a special comfort to him after the death of his mother. So this is the first mention of spousal love in the Bible. We first hear love from one human to another in the 22nd chapter when we're talking about when God is talking about Abraham's love for Isaac. For Isaac. Now, in American culture, if you remember the old playground rhyme, first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes the baby and the baby carriage. Hey, I'm all about the baby and the baby carriage coming last in that order. But in verse 67, as it is with the vast majority of cultures on this planet, marriage comes before love. Hear me out. So here in this verse, we heard it say, and she became his wife. He loved her deeply. She was his wife first, and then he fell in love with her. American culture, I put some notes, maybe I'll make an essay out of this sooner or later. American culture is unique in its assumption that people should marry primarily for love, perhaps more than all other Western cultures. Most of the world marries for procreation, for survival, for escape, or are forced into it. As in this verse, in most cultures, marriage comes before love. So if we look at some examples earlier in the Bible, Adam may have loved Eve by virtue of the poetry that he was inspired to recite or even write on the spot, improvise right there on the spot in the second verse of Genesis, second chapter of Genesis, verse 23. But they're never actually said to love each other. Jewish tradition suggests that Sarah may have left Abraham after learning of the near sacrifice of Isaac in chapter 22, hence her death in Hebron and not Beersheba, where they were living before. That's in chapter 21, or chapter 23, verse 1. But Abraham's subsequent mourning suggests strong emotion for her, though we don't actually have the word love associated. Royal families in biblical times and in modern times arrange weddings for political purposes. Most Indians, I mean Indians as in the country of India, not Native Americans, most Indians are strong believers in arranged marriages. Many testify to falling in love after getting married. I'm referring to the Hindu caste system, which is tied into their laws, though it's not as much of a law that they stick by the caste system today. Many of them, I actually have many friends whose marriages were arranged. They didn't really even think about it, like whether they were going to love their spouse or not. But I personally don't know anybody who grew up in a culture of arranged marriage who actually had their marriage arranged who complain about it. Almost every example I've ever seen ends up in the couple who was arranged to be married falling in love with each other. Actor, comedian, second-generation immigrant Jimmy O. Yang. Great comedian. If you get the chance, he's a good actor too. He talks about a story. He says this in his stand-up comedy, but I've also heard him speak about it seriously in interviews. He's having a conversation with his dad. They've all immigrated from China. He asks his dad, "Dad, after 38 years, do you still love Mom?" Which is a very American question for him to ask his dad, because he grew up in America. His dad and his mom grew up in China. Again, he asks his dad, "After 38 years, do you still love Mom?" His dad says, "Love? Your mom married me to escape communist China. It's not love, it's a good deal. North Koreans don't even use the word love. The word love is not a part of their language except when they're referencing their great leader who seems hell-bent on starving his own people to death. You remember how we talked about in verses 2, 4, and 11 about how humans use language to define their perception of objective reality and how we distort that when we do things like lie or when we try to create language for things that don't exist. That is what has happened with the North Koreans. Their reality is being distorted by the virtue of the fact that they can't even say the word love when talking to each other. It only has to do with this great leader that they think is some kind of God. That's the only time they use the word love. I'll end with an example from Fiddler on the Roof, which is a play, musical play that takes place in 19th century feudal Russia about a Russian Jewish family. Here's a conversation between a husband and wife, Tevye and Goldie. Tevye asks his wife, "Do you love me?" Goldie says, "I'm your wife." Tevye says, "I know, but do you love me?" Goldie says to herself, "Do I love him? For 25 years I've lived with him, fought with him, starved with him. 25 years, my bed is his." Tevye gets embarrassed. He goes, "Shh," because when she declares, "My bed is his," that's a very sexually charged statement there for 19th century feudal Russia. Goldie says, "If that's not love, what is?" Tevye says, "Then you love me." Goldie says, "I suppose I do." Tevye says, "And I suppose I love you too." And then later, regarding Tevye's discovery of his wife's love for him, he says, "It doesn't mean a thing, I know. But after 25 years, it's nice to know." There you go. Those are my notes on the second half of chapter 24. Thank you so much for checking it out and for watching. Again, I thought Reverend Stone went above and beyond and did an excellent job with it. I just can't get the video of it for the YouTube channel, so that's why I decided to go ahead and record this tomorrow. Tomorrow. We'll be going on with chapter 25, and if my voice is doing as well as it is now, I'll be there, and I'll be socially distancing, but I think I'm out of the woods here. I do hope to go back to work later this week and be ready to rock and roll. I love you all. I thank you all for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful week.